The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. My father's boss was on the other end, and the first word out of his mouth changed everything I thought I knew about my life. "Captain," he said, and I knew he wasn't talking to my dad. "I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." 23 years. That's how long I'd been living under the weight of two words that shaped every decision I ever made. You'll see. My parents, Linda and Robert Mitchell, had a peculiar way of showing disappointment. They didn't yell or throw things. They just looked at me with this expression that said everything and nothing at once, followed by those two words that became the soundtrack of my childhood. When I brought home a C+ in algebra, Mom would glance at Dad across the dinner table. "You'll see," she'd murmur, cutting her meatloaf with surgical precision. When I got cut from the JV basketball team, Dad would shake his head while folding his newspaper. "You'll see, Marcus." The thing about growing up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, is that everyone knows everyone's business. My father worked as a maintenance supervisor at Hartwell Industries, one of those mid-sized manufacturing companies that keep small Midwestern towns alive. He'd been there for 18 years, reliable as clockwork, respected by his peers, trusted by management. Robert Mitchell was the kind of man who fixed things: broken machinery, scheduling conflicts, employee disputes. Everything except his relationship with his only son. My mother taught 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary. She had infinite patience for 8-year-olds who couldn't tie their shoes or remember to raise their hands before speaking. But when it came to her own child, that patience seemed to evaporate like morning dew. Linda Mitchell could nurture 30 kids through their multiplication tables, but she couldn't see past my mediocre report cards to find something worth encouraging. High school was a collection of almosts. Almost made varsity, almost got into the honor society, almost asked Sarah Henderson to prom. Almost felt like I belonged somewhere. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, tried to help me find my path, but every conversation felt like I was walking through fog. Engineering? You'll need better math scores. Business? Your leadership experience is limited. Liberal arts? Mom's eye roll could be seen from space. The college acceptance letters arrived in March of my senior year. 3 acceptances, 2 waitlists, 4 rejections. Northern Iowa State offered me a spot in their general studies program. Not exactly the kind of achievement that makes parents beam with pride, but it was something. That night at dinner, I announced my decision to accept. "General studies," Dad repeated, not looking up from his pot roast. "That's not really a major, is it?" "It's exploratory," I explained, knowing how hollow it sounded. "I'll figure out what I want to do." Mom set down her fork. The silence stretched until I could hear the kitchen clock ticking. "You'll see," she finally said. College was supposed to be different. I was supposed to find myself, discover my passion, become the person I was meant to be. Instead, I found myself adrift in lecture halls, filled with students who seemed to know exactly where they were going, while I couldn't even decide on a major. I tried psychology, switched to communications, dabbled in business courses, even took a pottery class that I genuinely enjoyed until I remembered that art wasn't practical. By sophomore year, I'd settled on business administration mostly because it sounded responsible. My grades were decent. Nothing spectacular, but decent. I made a few friends, joined the intramural softball league, and learned to do my own laundry without turning everything pink. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. The phone calls home became increasingly awkward. Mom would ask about my classes, and I'd give vague answers about marketing principles and organizational behavior. Dad would ask if I was learning anything useful, which was his way of asking if I was preparing for a real job. They'd update me on happenings in Cedar Rapids. Who got promoted, who got married, who bought a new house. The subtext was always the same. Life was moving forward for everyone except their son. Summer break meant returning home to a house that felt smaller than I remembered. I got a job at the local hardware store, stocking shelves and helping customers find the right screws and paint colors. It wasn't glamorous, but I was good at it. I understood how things fit together, could visualize solutions to problems, had the patience to explain the difference between drywall anchors to confused homeowners. One afternoon in July, a woman came in looking frazzled. Her kitchen sink was leaking, and she had no idea what she needed to fix it. I walked her through the plumbing aisle, helped her identify the problem based on her description, and gathered all the necessary parts. 20 minutes later, she was armed with everything she needed and the confidence to tackle the repair herself. "You should be a teacher," she said as I rang up her purchase. "You have a gift for making complicated things simple." The comment stuck with me for days. Nobody had ever suggested I had a gift for anything. When fall semester started, I added an education course to my schedule: Introduction to Teaching Methods. Professor Williams was one of those educators who made you believe that changing young minds was the most important work in the world. She talked about creating environments where every student could succeed, about meeting kids where they are instead of where you think they should be. For the first time since elementary school, I felt genuinely excited about something academic. The coursework clicked in a way that business classes never had. Child development psychology, classroom management strategies, curriculum design, it all made sense. I started volunteering as a tutor in the university's Learning Center, working with students who struggled in subjects that came easily to others. There was this kid, Tommy Rodriguez, a freshman who'd been placed in remedial math despite being incredibly bright. His high school hadn't prepared him well, and he was convinced he was stupid. We worked together twice a week for an entire semester. I watched him go from failing basic algebra to confidently solving complex equations. The day he got his first A on a test, he literally jumped out of his chair and hugged me. That's when I knew. Not business, not communications, not general studies. Education. I wanted to be the teacher who saw potential where others saw problems. I wanted to be the person who helped kids realize they were capable of more than they'd been told. The conversation with my parents didn't go well. Teaching? Mom's voice hit that particular pitch that meant she was trying not to lose her temper. "Marcus, teachers don't make any money." "You're a teacher," I pointed out. "That's different. I had to work. We needed 2 incomes. But you're smart enough to do something better." Dad leaned back in his kitchen chair, the one that creaked whenever he shifted his weight. "Son, I've been breaking my back for 20 years, so you could have opportunities I never had. And you want to throw that away to babysit other people's kids?" "It's not babysitting, it's—" "You'll see," Mom interrupted. There were those words again, but this time they felt different, more final, like a door closing. I changed my major anyway. Elementary education, with a focus on mathematics. My grades improved dramatically. I was engaged, motivated, genuinely excited about my future for the first time in my life. I student taught at Lincoln Elementary in Ames, working with 5th graders who reminded me of myself at that age. Smart enough but convinced they weren't. Capable but lacking confidence. My supervising teacher, Mrs. Carmen Rodriguez, Tommy's aunt, as it turned out, became a mentor. She taught me that teaching wasn't just about curriculum standards and lesson plans. It was about seeing each child as a complete person, with their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. She showed me how to create classroom environments where mistakes were learning opportunities, where questions were celebrated, where every student felt valued. Graduation day arrived in May. Mom and Dad came to the ceremony, took the obligatory photos, joined me for lunch afterward. The conversation was polite but strained. They asked about job prospects, about salary expectations, about whether I'd considered keeping my options open for other careers. "I'm a teacher now," I said, trying to keep the defensiveness out of my voice. "This is what I want to do." Dad stirred his coffee methodically. "You'll see," he said quietly. 3 weeks later, I accepted a position at Riverside Elementary, the same school where my mother taught 3rd grade. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Walking into Riverside Elementary as a teacher instead of a visitor felt surreal. The same hallways I'd wandered as a kid, the same cafeteria smell of mystery meat and cleaning solution, the same bulletin boards covered in construction paper artwork. But now I had my own classroom key, my own nameplate, Mr. Marcus Mitchell, 5th grade. Principal Janet Stevenson had paired me with Elena Vasquez, a veteran teacher who'd been at Riverside for 12 years. Elena became my lifeline during those first chaotic weeks. She taught me the unwritten rules, which copy machine actually worked, how to handle helicopter parents, why you never schedule parent conferences right after lunch duty. My classroom was room 118, tucked between the music room and the janitor's closet. 26 students, each with their own unique challenges and personalities. There was Ashley Chen, who finished every math assignment in half the time it took everyone else but struggled to show her work. David Thompson, who could barely sit still long enough to write his name but had an intuitive understanding of geometric concepts that amazed me. Maria Santos, whose family had just moved from El Salvador and was navigating English as her third language while trying to keep up with the grade-level curriculum. The first parent-teacher conferences were brutal, not because of the parents. Most were supportive and genuinely wanted their children to succeed. The brutal part was seeing my mother in action with her own students' families, then watching her interact with me during our brief hallway encounters. With other people's children, she was warm, encouraging, full of specific praise and constructive suggestions. With her own son, she offered polite nods and asked if I needed anything from the supply room. 3 months into the school year, something shifted. I'd been working with a student named Kevin Walsh, a kid who'd been labeled as having behavioral problems by his previous teachers. Kevin was angry, disruptive, constantly getting sent to the principal's office, but I noticed something others had missed. He was bored. The work was too easy for him, and he'd learned that acting out was more interesting than sitting quietly while everyone else caught up. I started giving Kevin additional challenges, more complex problems to solve while his classmates worked on standard exercises. Instead of punishing his energy, I channeled it, made him my classroom assistant for certain activities, gave him leadership roles in group projects. Within 2 weeks, the behavioral issues disappeared. More importantly, Kevin started smiling again. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The breakthrough came during a district-wide math assessment. My class scored in the 93rd percentile, the highest in the school's history. But the real victory was watching my students' faces as they realized they'd succeeded at something they'd previously found difficult. Kevin had scored in the 99th percentile and was recommended for the gifted program. Principal Stevenson called me into her office the next week. I expected praise for the test scores, maybe a pat on the back for turning around Kevin's behavior. Instead, she had a different conversation in mind. "Marcus, I've been watching you work this year. You have something special, a natural instinct for reaching kids who other teachers have given up on. Have you considered pursuing additional certifications?" She handed me a brochure for a summer program at the University of Iowa. Advanced certification in special education and learning differences. Full scholarship available for promising educators. I'd like to recommend you for this program. We need teachers who can bridge the gap between regular education and special services. Based on what I've seen, you'd be perfect for it. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at the application. Special education wasn't what I'd planned when I started teaching, but it felt right. Every day, I saw students who didn't fit the standard mold, who needed someone to meet them where they were instead of where the curriculum expected them to be. I filled out the application that night. The summer program was intense, 6 weeks of coursework, covering everything from autism spectrum disorders to dyslexia interventions, from behavior modification techniques to adaptive technology. My classmates were experienced teachers from across Iowa, many with advanced degrees and years of specialized training. I felt like an imposter at first, the rookie who'd stumbled into a field he barely understood. Dr. Patricia Hammond, the program director, had a different perspective. During our 3rd week, she pulled me aside after a particularly challenging case study discussion. "You have an unusual way of approaching problems," she said. "Most teachers start with the disability and work backward to the child. You start with the child and figure out how to work around whatever barriers exist. That's not something we can teach." The final project required developing an individualized education plan for a complex case. I was assigned to work with the family of an 11-year-old named Christopher Park, who had been diagnosed with multiple learning disabilities and had struggled through 5 different schools in 3 years. His parents, Susan and Michael Park, were exhausted from fighting systems that seemed designed to label their son rather than educate him. I spent hours with Christopher, not testing him or evaluating him, but just talking. He was fascinated by trains, not the typical childhood interest in locomotives, but a deep technical understanding of railway systems, scheduling, logistics. He could calculate the most efficient routes between cities, explain the physics of different track configurations, even design theoretical improvements to existing systems. But ask him to read a paragraph about trains from a textbook, and he'd struggle with words a second grader could handle. The insight came during our 4th session. Christopher wasn't stupid or lazy or defiant. His brain processed information differently. Instead of fighting that difference, what if we used it? I redesigned his entire learning approach around his interest in transportation systems. Math word problems became railway logistics challenges. Reading comprehension used articles about train technology. Geography lessons explored trade routes and transportation networks. Christopher's parents cried when I presented the plan, not from sadness but from relief. For the first time, someone had looked at their son and seen potential instead of problems. The program ended with a presentation day where families and school administrators could observe our work. Christopher demonstrated his learning by giving a 20-minute presentation on the economic impact of high-speed rail development, complete with charts, graphs, and cost-benefit analyses that would have impressed business school graduates. Dr. Hammond approached me afterward. "Have you thought about pursuing a master's degree? There's a research position opening up next fall. Half-time teaching, half-time working on innovative approaches to learning differences. Full tuition coverage plus a stipend." Back at Riverside Elementary for my 2nd year, everything felt different. I'd been assigned to work with students across multiple grade levels, focusing on children who needed specialized approaches. My official title was Learning Specialist, which sounded impressive but basically meant I was the teacher they called when traditional methods weren't working. The position put me in contact with parents who'd been through years of frustration, students who'd learned to see themselves as failures, teachers who genuinely wanted to help but didn't know how. I became a translator between different perspectives, helping everyone understand that learning differences weren't deficits, they were just differences. Word spread beyond Riverside Elementary. Other schools in the district started requesting consultations. I developed workshops for teachers, created resource guides for parents, even testified at school board meetings about the importance of individualized approaches to education. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents, who'd spent years telling me I'd never amount to anything, worked in the same building where I was making a measurable difference in children's lives. Mom would occasionally peek into my workspace when she thought I wasn't looking, watching me work with students. She never said anything, but I caught glimpses of something in her expression that might have been pride. Dad was harder to read. He'd pick me up for lunch sometimes, and we'd drive to the sandwich shop downtown without talking much. But he started asking questions about my work, about the kids I helped, about the research program I'd been accepted into. Small questions, careful questions, like he was trying to understand something he'd previously dismissed. The acceptance letter for the master's program arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March. Full academic scholarship, research assistantship, opportunity to work with Dr. Hammond on developing new interventional strategies for children with complex learning profiles. I called my parents to share the news. A master's degree? Mom's voice carried a note I'd never heard before, not skepticism, surprise, maybe even excitement. In special education, I explained. It's a research position. They want me to develop new teaching methods. There was a long pause. Then Dad's voice, uncharacteristically soft. That's really something, Marcus. For the first time in my adult life, they didn't follow up with, "You'll see." The University of Iowa campus in fall felt like stepping into a different universe. Graduate school meant research labs instead of colorful classrooms, academic conferences instead of playground duty, theoretical frameworks instead of finger painting. My cohort consisted of seasoned educators with decades of experience, and once again I felt like the outsider looking in. Dr. Hammond assigned me to work with her on a groundbreaking study examining the effectiveness of interest-based learning interventions for children with complex learning profiles. The The research questioned fundamental assumptions about how we categorize and teach students with disabilities. Instead of focusing on what children couldn't do, we explored what happened when curriculum was built around what they could do exceptionally well. My primary research partner was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Kevin from my classroom despite the coincidence. Jennifer had spent 15 years as a school psychologist before transitioning to research. She approached learning differences from a clinical perspective while I brought practical classroom experience. Our different backgrounds created friction at first, then unexpected synergy. The study followed 43 students across 6 school districts over 2 academic years. Each child had been previously labeled as having multiple learning disabilities and had struggled in traditional educational settings. We developed individualized learning plans that used their areas of exceptional ability as gateways to addressing their challenges. There was Miguel Rodriguez, whose mathematical genius was masked by severe dyslexia. Traditional approaches had him failing basic reading while excelling in calculus, a combination that frustrated every teacher he'd ever had. We developed a program that used mathematical concepts to teach phonics and reading comprehension. Within 8 months, his reading level jumped 3 grades. Sarah Kim had autism spectrum disorder and had been written off as nonverbal and intellectually disabled. But she had perfect pitch and could reproduce any musical composition after hearing it once. We created a communication system based on musical patterns and rhythms. Sarah's first full sentence came through a song she composed about her pet goldfish. The results were staggering. By the end of the first year, 38 of the 43 students had made significant academic gains. More importantly, their self-perception had transformed. Children who'd previously seen themselves as broken began understanding that their brains simply worked differently. The research attracted attention beyond Iowa. Educational psychology journals published our preliminary findings. Conference invitations started arriving from universities across the Midwest. Dr. Hammond encouraged me to present our work at the National Association of Special Education Teachers Conference in Chicago. Standing in front of 400 educators, sharing research that challenged decades of established practice, felt surreal. The presentation went well. Questions were thoughtful. Feedback was positive. Several attendees approached afterward requesting consultation on implementing similar programs in their districts. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Robert Chen from Northwestern University introduced himself after my presentation. His daughter Ashley, the same Ashley Chen who'd been in my 5th grade classroom, was now thriving in middle school advanced mathematics. "She still talks about you," he said. "Says you were the first teacher who understood that being fast at math didn't make her weird, it made her gifted. That changed everything for her." Back in Cedar Rapids for winter break, the dynamic at family dinners had shifted. Dad asked detailed questions about my research, wanted to understand how the programs worked, even suggested ways the manufacturing principles from his job might apply to educational systems. Mom shared stories about students in her own classroom who might benefit from the approaches I was developing. The conversation that changed everything happened on New Year's Eve. We were sitting in the living room, watching the countdown on TV, when Dad cleared his throat in that way that meant he had something important to say. "Marcus, I need to tell you something. Last month, my supervisor asked me to participate in a workplace literacy program. Some of the younger employees were struggling with technical manuals and safety protocols. The company wanted experienced workers to help mentor them." He paused, staring at his hands. "I didn't know how to teach, never thought of myself as someone who could help others learn. But I remembered some of the things you told us about meeting people where they are, about finding what motivates them. I tried using those ideas." The program had been a success. Dad had helped 6 employees improve their technical reading skills by connecting the material to practical applications they cared about. His supervisor had been so impressed that they'd asked him to lead the program district-wide. "They want me to train other supervisors in 12 factories across 3 states, he continued, teaching them how to teach their own workers. Me, a guy who barely graduated high school, training college-educated managers about education." Mom reached over and squeezed his hand. "Your father declined the position initially. He didn't think he was qualified." But then I realized, Dad said, looking directly at me for the first time during the conversation, everything I learned about helping those workers came from listening to you talk about your students. You've been teaching me to be a teacher without either of us realizing it. The spring semester brought new challenges and opportunities. Dr. Hammond had secured funding for a 3-year longitudinal study, tracking our intervention methods across 15 school districts. I was named co-principal investigator, responsible for overseeing implementation and training teachers in the new approaches. The work required traveling across Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota, conducting workshops for educators who were often skeptical of methods that contradicted their traditional training. Many had been teaching for decades using deficit-based models that focused on fixing problems rather than building on strengths. The breakthrough presentation happened in Minneapolis, at Roosevelt Middle School. The principal, Dr. Marcus Johnson, had invited me reluctantly. His district was mandating the training, but he'd made it clear he thought it was a waste of time. I arrived to find 47 teachers crammed into a cafeteria, arms crossed, expressions ranging from bored to hostile. The morning session went poorly. Questions were challenging, comments were dismissive, and I could feel the room's energy working against me. During lunch, I overheard conversations about another educational fad and impractical university theories. My confidence was shaking when Dr. Johnson approached. "Look, Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but my teachers are dealing with real problems. We have kids who can't read, can't do basic math, can't sit still long enough to learn anything. We need practical solutions, not research theories." Instead of defending my methods, I asked him about specific students. He described Marcus Williams, a 7th grader who'd been held back twice, had been suspended multiple times for disruptive behavior, and was being considered for alternative placement. "Can I spend 30 minutes with Marcus?" I asked. Dr. Johnson was skeptical but agreed. Marcus was brought to the cafeteria, a thin kid with defensive eyes and the slouched posture of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. I talked with him about video games, discovered he was obsessed with strategy games that required complex planning and resource management. "What if we treated math like a strategy game?" I suggested. "Instead of abstract problems, what if you were managing resources for an army, calculating supply lines and troop movements?" For the next 20 minutes, Marcus solved algebraic equations disguised as military logistics problems that his regular math teacher said he couldn't handle. The teachers who'd gathered to watch grew quiet as this problem student demonstrated mathematical reasoning that exceeded grade-level expectations. "The kid's not stupid," I explained to the room afterward. "His brain processes information through gaming logic. Instead of forcing him into our preferred learning style, what if we adapted our teaching to match how he naturally thinks?" The afternoon session was completely different. Teachers started sharing their own challenging students, asking how interest-based approaches might work in their specific situations. Dr. Johnson stayed after the official end time, requesting additional resources and follow-up support. 6 months later, Roosevelt Middle School's test scores had improved dramatically. More importantly, their suspension rates had dropped by 40%. Marcus Williams was excelling in advanced mathematics and had been selected for a summer engineering program at the University of Minnesota. The success stories multiplied across districts. Teachers reported higher engagement, improved academic outcomes, and better classroom management. Students who'd previously struggled were discovering abilities they didn't know they had. Parents were seeing their children's confidence transform. But the most unexpected recognition came from an entirely different direction. The Iowa Department of Education nominated our research program for a National Excellence Award. The ceremony was scheduled for Washington, D.C. in June, with representatives from all 50 states attending. Dr. Hammond and I would be presenting our findings to federal education officials, policymakers, and researchers from major universities. The invitation letter mentioned that successful programs would be considered for nationwide implementation through federal education grants. "This could change how we approach learning differences across the entire country," Dr. Hammond said as we planned our presentation. "Your classroom insights combined with rigorous research methodology, it's exactly what the field needs." The night before leaving for Washington, I called my parents to let them know about the trip. Dad answered on the second ring. "Washington, D.C.? His voice carried that familiar note of disbelief, but this time it sounded different, not dismissive, impressed. It's just a research presentation, I said, trying to downplay the significance. Just a research presentation, he repeated slowly. Marcus, do you realize what this means? The federal government is asking for your expertise. You're influencing national education policy. There was a pause, then Mom's voice in the background. Tell him we're proud of him. Dad cleared his throat. Your mother says we're proud of you. And she's right. We are. They weren't words I'd been waiting to hear anymore. I'd found my own validation through the students whose lives had changed, the teachers who'd embraced new approaches, the research that was reshaping how we understood learning differences. But hearing them meant more than I'd expected. The Marriott Hotel in downtown Washington felt like neutral territory between my small-town Iowa origins and the unprecedented opportunity ahead. Dr. Hammond and I had spent weeks preparing for the National Education Excellence Summit, but nothing could have prepared me for the scale of what we were walking into. The conference center buzzed with conversations in multiple languages. Representatives from Finland discussed their revolutionary approach to eliminating standardized testing. Japanese educators shared data on collaborative learning models. Canadian researchers presented findings on indigenous education methodologies. And here I was, a kid from Cedar Rapids who'd barely survived his own K-12 experience, about to present research that could influence American education policy. Our presentation was scheduled for the second day in the main auditorium to an audience that included Deputy Secretary of Education Dr. Maria Santos, directors from major foundations, and researchers from Harvard, Stanford, and MIT. The title of our session, Transforming Deficit-Based Special Education Through Strength-Based Individual Learning Pathways. The morning of our presentation, I woke up at 4:30 a.m. with my heart racing. Not from nerves about public speaking. I'd grown comfortable with that over the past year. The anxiety came from a deeper realization. This moment represented everything my parents had told me I'd never achieve. National recognition, policy influence, research that could help millions of children who'd been written off by traditional educational systems. Dr. Hammond met me for breakfast, sensing my internal struggle without me having to explain it. You know what I've learned in 20 years of research? She said, stirring her coffee. The most transformative educators are often the ones who struggled themselves. You understand these children because you were one of them. The auditorium held 400 people. As I looked out at the audience, I recognized faces from textbooks I'd read in graduate school, authors whose research had shaped my understanding of learning differences, administrators who controlled budgets affecting millions of students. Our presentation began with video footage from my original 5th grade classroom. Kevin Walsh, the behavior problems student, explaining his mathematical thinking process. Christopher Park demonstrating his transportation-based learning system. Miguel Rodriguez reading aloud from a text he'd previously found impossible. Traditional special education asks what's wrong with these children and how we can fix them, I said, advancing to the next slide. Our research asks what's exceptional about these children and how we can build on those strengths to address their challenges. The data was compelling. Across 15 districts, 312 students had participated in our strength-based intervention programs over 2 academic years. Academic gains averaged 1.8 grade levels in reading, 2.1 grade levels in mathematics. Behavioral incidents decreased by 67%. Most significantly, standardized measures of student self-efficacy and academic confidence increased dramatically. But the statistics didn't capture the real story. The real story was in the voices of children who'd stopped calling themselves stupid, teachers who'd rediscovered why they entered education, parents who'd found hope after years of discouragement. During the question and answer session, Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the Gates Foundation asked about scalability. These results are impressive, but they seem to require significant individualization. How do we implement this approach in districts serving tens of thousands of students? It was the question I'd been anticipating and dreading. The honest answer was that our methods required a fundamental shift in how teachers thought about curriculum, assessment, and classroom management. It wasn't a program you could purchase and implement. It was a philosophy that required systemic change. You're right that individualization is complex, I replied. But consider the alternative. We're currently spending billions of dollars on programs that sort children into categories based on their deficits. What if we invested that same money in training teachers to recognize and build on individual strengths? The conversation continued for 30 minutes beyond our scheduled time. Representatives from 6 states requested follow-up meetings. The Department of Education's Special Programs Division invited us to submit a proposal for a 5-year, multi-million-dollar research grant. That evening, at the conference reception, I found myself in conversations that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. Dr. Linda Chen from UC Berkeley wanted to collaborate on teacher training programs. Officials from the Council of Chief State School Officers discussed policy implications. A publisher approached us about writing a book that would make our research accessible to practicing educators. The most surreal moment came when Secretary Santos herself sought me out. "Mr. Mitchell, your presentation was remarkable. I've been working in education policy for 15 years, and I rarely see research that so clearly bridges the gap between academic theory and classroom practice." She handed me her business card. "We're forming an advisory committee on special education reform. Would you be interested in joining?" It would mean regular trips to Washington, input on federal guidelines, and the opportunity to shape policy affecting millions of children. I stared at the card with the official Department of Education seal, Marcus Mitchell, Policy Advisor. 3 years ago, I'd been apologizing to my parents for choosing teaching over business. Now the federal government was asking for my expertise on educational reform. The flight back to Iowa gave me time to process what had happened. Dr. Hammond spent most of the trip outlining the opportunities ahead: the research grant that could fund programs in 50 districts, the policy advisory role that would give us direct influence on federal regulations, the book contract that would disseminate our methods nationally. But my mind kept drifting to a different conversation. 2 weeks before leaving for Washington, I'd run into Mrs. Patterson, my old high school guidance counselor, at the grocery store. She'd aged considerably, but her eyes still held that mixture of optimism and realism that had made her effective with uncertain teenagers. "Marcus Mitchell," she'd said, genuinely surprised to see me, "I heard you were doing something special with special education. That's wonderful." We'd talked for 20 minutes in the cereal aisle. She remembered our conversations about college majors, about my parents' expectations, about my uncertainty regarding the future. What she said next had stayed with me through the entire Washington trip. "You know, I always suspected you'd find your way." The students who struggle to fit into predetermined categories often become the adults who change those categories. Back in Cedar Rapids, I drove straight from the airport to my parents' house. It was nearly midnight, but lights were still on. They met me at the door, eager to hear about the conference, the presentation, the opportunities that might emerge. I told them about the standing ovation, the policy advisory invitation, the research grant proposal. Dad asked detailed questions about the funding mechanisms and implementation timelines. His industrial background had given him an appreciation for project management that applied to educational initiatives. Mom wanted to know about the students featured in our presentation, about how the research might help children currently struggling in traditional classrooms. For the first time, she seemed to understand that my work wasn't just about individual students in my classroom. It was about changing systems that had failed countless children over decades. "There's something else," I said, pulling out my phone to show them the video Dr. Hammond had recorded during our presentation. "I want you to see how the audience reacted." The video showed the moment when I'd explained our philosophy of starting with children's strengths rather than their deficits. The auditorium had gone completely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of disagreement, but the focused silence of people hearing an idea that reframes everything they thought they knew. As the video ended, Dad set down his coffee mug and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not pride exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Understanding? "You know what strikes me about all this?" he said slowly. "You've been doing the same thing your whole life. Looking at situations differently than everyone else. Finding potential where others saw problems. We just didn't recognize it." Mom nodded. "Remember when you were 8 and you reorganized your entire bedroom so your goldfish tank got better light? We thought you were being difficult, but you were solving a problem the rest of us hadn't even noticed." Or in high school when you tutored Jenny Morrison in algebra even though you were barely passing the class yourself, Dad added. You found a way to explain concepts that made sense to her when 3 different teachers had given up. They were right. The skills that had made me effective with challenging students weren't something I'd developed in college or graduate school. They'd been there all along, dismissed as stubbornness or misguided idealism by people who couldn't see past conventional expectations. The irony was almost overwhelming. My parents had spent decades telling me I'd never amount to anything, while the very qualities they'd criticized were the foundation of work that was now being recognized at the highest levels of American education. But sitting in their kitchen at midnight, sharing stories about the conference and the opportunities ahead, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. We were no longer having the same conversation we'd been having for 25 years. This wasn't about proving them wrong or validating my choices. It was about recognizing that all of us, parents and children alike, are capable of growth, change, and seeing familiar situations from entirely new perspectives. 6 months after Washington, life had taken on a rhythm I'd never imagined possible. My desk at the University of Iowa was covered with correspondence from school districts across 12 states requesting implementation support. The federal research grant had been approved, $4.2 million over 5 years, to expand our strength-based intervention programs nationally. The Policy Advisory Committee meetings happened monthly in Washington, where I found myself in conference rooms with education leaders whose names I'd read in academic journals throughout graduate school. The surreal nature of these experiences never quite wore off. During one meeting, I proposed modifications to federal special education guidelines that would prioritize strength-based assessments over deficit-focused evaluations. 6 months later, those recommendations became official Department of Education policy. But the work that mattered most still happened in classrooms. Every week, I visited schools implementing our programs, working directly with teachers and students who reminded me why I'd chosen education in the first place. There was Maria Santos from Lincoln Elementary in Des Moines, whose artistic abilities had been channeled into a multimedia learning system that helped her master both English and mathematics. Thomas Wright in Kansas City, whose fascination with weather patterns became the foundation for understanding complex scientific concepts he'd previously found impossible. The book project consumed my evenings and weekends. Beyond Broken, transforming special education through student strengths was due to the publisher by December. Writing for an audience of practicing educators meant translating research findings into practical strategies that could work in real classrooms, with limited resources and overwhelming demands. The most challenging chapter focused on changing institutional mindsets. How do you convince administrators who've invested decades in deficit-based systems that strength-based approaches aren't just feel-good philosophy, but evidence-based practice that produces measurable results? How do you help teachers recognize potential in students they've been trained to see as problems? My editor, Rachel Kim from Teachers College Press, pushed me to include more personal narrative. Educators need to understand that this isn't just academic theory, she said during one of our phone conferences. They need to know this comes from someone who's actually been in their shoes, who understands the daily realities of teaching. So I wrote about Kevin Walsh, about Christopher Park, about the moment I realized that my own educational struggles had prepared me to reach children who didn't fit conventional molds. I wrote about the parent conferences where I'd watched families discover that their children weren't broken, just different. I wrote about teachers who'd rediscovered their passion for education when they saw students succeeding in ways they'd never imagined possible. The personal sections were the hardest to write. How do you explain to strangers that your parents spent 20 years telling you you'd never amount to anything, without making them seem cruel or uncaring? How do you convey that their skepticism came from love, from a desire to protect me from disappointment in a world that seemed to reward conformity over creativity? One evening in October, while working on the chapter about family dynamics and educational expectations, my phone rang. Dad's number appeared on the screen at 11:30 p.m., unusual timing that immediately triggered concern. "Marcus, I need to tell you something," he said without preamble. His voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "Something happened at work today." My stomach dropped. At 62, Dad was approaching retirement, and I'd been worried about his health, about the physical demands of his job, about what he'd do when his identity as a problem solver at Hartwell Industries came to an end. "Are you okay? Is it your heart? Did something happen to Mom?" "No, nothing like that. It's..." Well, it's complicated. You remember I told you about the literacy program I've been running? The one where I teach other supervisors how to help their workers? I remembered. Over the past year, Dad's workplace education initiatives had expanded across 3 states. Hartwell Industries had become a model for other manufacturing companies interested in improving worker literacy and technical skills. Today, corporate headquarters flew in from Detroit, the CEO, the board of directors, the whole executive team. They wanted to observe our training program and meet with the people running it. Dad paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. They interviewed me for 2 hours, Marcus. Asked about my background, my education, how I developed the teaching methods I've been using. When I told them I learned everything from listening to my son talk about his research, they wanted to know more about you. Dad, what are you trying to tell me? They offered me a position, Director of Workforce Development for the entire company. I'd be responsible for literacy and skills training programs in 47 facilities across 8 states. It's a vice president level position, Marcus. They want me to move to Detroit and oversee a department of 12 people. The silence stretched between us. My father, who'd spent 18 years as a maintenance supervisor, was being offered an executive position based on educational principles he'd learned from his son. The same son he'd once told would never amount to anything. That's incredible, Dad. Are you going to take it? Another pause. I already did, but that's not why I'm calling. He cleared his throat, that familiar sound that meant he was about to say something important. The CEO asked me where I learned about education and training methodologies. I told him about your research, about the work you're doing with special education, about the book you're writing. He'd never heard of strength-based learning approaches, but when I explained how they work, he got very interested. Interested how? Hartwell Industries has been struggling with training programs for employees who learn differently. Traditional methods aren't working for about 30% of their workforce. People with dyslexia, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders. They've been spending millions on programs with limited success. I could feel the conversation building towards something significant. Marcus, they want to hire you as a consultant. They want you to adapt your educational research for corporate training applications. It would be a 6-figure contract, and they're talking about expanding it to other companies in their network. The irony was staggering. My father's boss, the man who'd employed him for 18 years, was offering me a position that would dwarf any salary I could earn in traditional education. The same principles that had helped struggling students in elementary classrooms could transform how corporations approach workforce development. There's something else, Dad continued. During the interview, when they asked about my qualifications for the director position, I told them I didn't have a college degree. I explained that I'm just a guy who learned how to see potential instead of problems, how to meet people where they are instead of where I think they should be. His voice cracked slightly. You know what the CEO said? He said those are exactly the qualifications they need. That too many of their managers have degrees but no understanding of how to actually help people learn and grow. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. Dad told me about his plans for the new position, about programs he wanted to develop, about his vision for changing how manufacturing companies approach worker education. But underneath the professional discussion was a deeper conversation about recognition, about potential, about the strange ways life validates choices that once seemed questionable. The next morning, I called Dr. Hammond to discuss the corporate consulting opportunity. Her response surprised me. This could be transformative, she said. If we can demonstrate that strength-based approaches work in corporate settings, it validates the universality of our principles. Learning differences don't disappear when people enter the workforce. Within 2 weeks, I was in Detroit, meeting with Hartwell Industries' executive team. The parallels between their struggling employees and my former students were obvious. Workers who'd been labeled as slow learners or training problems often had specific cognitive differences that made traditional instruction ineffective. I spent 3 days observing their current training programs, interviewing employees who'd struggled with standard approaches, and designing pilot interventions that used individual strengths to address skill gaps. The principles were identical to what worked in elementary classrooms. Start with what people do well, build confidence through early successes, then gradually introduce challenging concepts through familiar frameworks. The pilot program launched in January with 43 employees across 3 facilities. Workers who had previously failed multiple training attempts began mastering complex technical skills when instruction was adapted to their learning styles. Safety protocol compliance improved dramatically when information was presented through visual, auditory, and kinesthetic methods simultaneously. But the moment that changed everything happened during a site visit to the Cleveland facility in March. I was observing a training session when the plant manager, Bill Harrison, approached me with a confused expression. "Are you the education consultant, Marcus Mitchell?" I confirmed my identity, wondering if there was a problem with the program. "I need to tell you something. My daughter Emma is in 5th grade at Riverside Elementary in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She's been struggling with math anxiety for 2 years, but this year she has this teacher who's completely transformed her relationship with learning." My heart stopped. Emma Harrison. Blonde hair, quiet demeanor, brilliant insights about geometric patterns but paralyzed by timed tests and competitive classroom environments. Her teacher developed this individualized approach that uses Emma's love of art to teach mathematical concepts. She went from crying about math homework to creating geometric art projects that demonstrate advanced mathematical thinking. Bill pulled out his phone to show me pictures of Emma's work, intricate patterns that illustrated concepts like symmetry, proportion, and spatial relationships. The teacher's name is Mrs. Rodriguez, Elena Rodriguez. She told us she learned these methods from a colleague who'd gone on to do research at the university level. Someone named Marcus Mitchell. The world seemed to stop. Elena had taken the approaches I'd shared during our time working together at Riverside Elementary and adapted them for her own students. Emma's transformation was a direct result of methods I'd developed, implemented by my former mentor, in the school where my mother still taught 3rd grade. "Your daughter's teacher was my colleague when I started at Riverside," I managed to say. "I'm glad the methods are helping Emma." Bill's expression shifted from confusion to amazement. "You're that Marcus Mitchell? The one who developed the teaching methods that saved my daughter's relationship with learning?" That evening, I called my parents to share the day's revelations. Mom answered the phone with excitement in her voice. "Marcus, we heard from Elena today. She's been using some of your techniques with her students, and the results have been incredible. She wanted us to know that Emma Harrison, you remember the Harrison family from church, has gone from struggling with math to being recommended for the gifted program." "I know," I said quietly. "I met Emma's father today, at Hartwell Industries." The silence that followed contained 25 years of misunderstanding, gradual recognition, and ultimate validation. My parents had spent decades believing I'd chosen a career with limited impact and minimal recognition. They couldn't have imagined that their son's work would eventually influence corporate training programs, federal education policy, and individual children's lives simultaneously. But the real transformation wasn't in external recognition or professional success. It was in the understanding that every person, whether they're a struggling student, a concerned parent, or an industrial supervisor, has the potential to learn, grow, and contribute in ways that defy conventional expectations. At 2:47 a.m. on that Tuesday night in April, when Dad's boss called and addressed me as Captain, I finally understood that the journey from disappointment to recognition isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about discovering that the qualities that make you different might be exactly what the world needs. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September. I'd been working late on curriculum revisions for the Department of Education, finalizing guidelines that would affect special education programs across all 50 states. The sudden ring cut through the silence of my apartment like an alarm. Dad's boss, James Patterson, CEO of Hartwell Industries, the man who'd offered my father the vice president position, who'd hired me as their corporate education consultant, who'd transformed a manufacturing company into a model for inclusive workforce development. "Captain," he said, and my heart stopped. "Not Mr. Mitchell, not Marcus, Captain. I'm sorry to call so late, but I needed to reach you immediately. We have a situation." My mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened to Dad? Was there a problem with one of our training programs? Had a worker been injured during a session I'd designed? "What's wrong?" I asked, already reaching for my clothes. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. That's why I'm calling." Patterson's voice carried an excitement I'd never heard before. In our 6 months of working together, he'd been professional, supportive, occasionally enthusiastic about program results. But this was different. "Marcus, do you know what happened today? 3 things that I need to tell you about." I sat back down, sensing this wasn't an emergency but something else entirely. First, the Department of Labor called. They want to use our workforce development model as the national standard for companies with federal contracts. Every major manufacturer in America will be required to implement training programs based on the principles you developed. The magnitude of that statement took a moment to process. Federal contracts represented billions of dollars in manufacturing work. If companies were required to use our approaches, it would affect hundreds of thousands of workers with learning differences. Second, the preliminary data from our 6-month pilot program came in. Productivity is up 18% across all participating facilities. Worker satisfaction scores have reached the highest levels in company history. Workplace accidents are down 37%. The safety improvements alone are saving us $2 million annually. I tried to respond, but Patterson wasn't finished. Third, and this is why I'm calling you Captain, Harvard Business School contacted us today. They want to write a case study about our transformation from a traditional manufacturing company to an industry leader in inclusive education practices. They're calling it the Hartwell Revolution, how one company redefined human potential. The word captain finally made sense. In military and naval contexts, a captain leads transformative missions. Patterson wasn't just acknowledging my role as a consultant, he was recognizing me as the person who'd led a fundamental change in how his company understood human capability. But here's what you don't know, he continued. The Harvard team spent 3 days interviewing employees, managers, and executives. They kept asking the same question: who was responsible for this transformation? Every single person gave the same answer. Patterson paused for effect. They all said Robert Mitchell, your father. They said he was the one who brought a completely new way of thinking about human potential to Hartwell Industries. But when they interviewed your father, he told them something that stopped them in their tracks. I could barely breathe. He said, "I didn't create anything new. I just finally learned to listen to my son." The conversation that followed lasted until sunrise. Patterson explained that Harvard's case study would focus on intergenerational learning, how wisdom can flow from children to parents, from students to teachers, from unexpected sources to established institutions. The Hartwell story wasn't just about corporate transformation. It was about recognizing that innovation often comes from the people society least expects to change the world. There's something else, Patterson said as our call was winding down. We've been contacted by manufacturing companies in Germany, Japan, and South Korea. They want to license our training methods. Your educational principles are going global, Marcus. You're not just changing American education, you're influencing how the world thinks about human learning and potential. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment watching the sun rise over Iowa City, trying to process everything that had happened. 27 years old, and my work was influencing federal policy, corporate practices, and international education standards. The kid who couldn't figure out what to major in college was now helping reshape how society understands learning differences. But the real transformation wasn't in my professional achievements. It was in the phone call I made next. "Dad," I said when he answered on the second ring. "Did Patterson call you too?" "He did, at 3 in the morning. Your mother and I have been sitting here talking ever since." "Dad, I need to tell you something. All those years when you and Mom said I'd never amount to anything." "Marcus, stop." His voice was firm but gentle. "We need to talk about that. In person. Can you come home today?" 3 hours later, I was sitting in the same kitchen, where I'd endured countless conversations about my uncertain future, my questionable choices, my apparent lack of direction. But this conversation was different. Mom had made coffee and arranged photo albums on the table, pictures spanning my entire life. Elementary school science fairs, high school graduation, college commencement, my first day of teaching, the Washington conference, the Harvard Business School interview. "We've been looking at these pictures all night," Mom said, her voice quiet, trying to understand how we missed something so obvious. Dad opened the oldest album, pointing to a picture of 5-year-old me explaining my elaborate Lego creation to anyone who would listen. "You were always teaching," he said. "Even as a little kid, You were showing other children how things worked, helping them solve problems, making complicated ideas simple. We just didn't recognize it as a strength. Mom turned to a picture from my sophomore year of high school, me tutoring Jenny Morrison in our living room, both of us bent over algebra textbooks. You were failing the class yourself, but somehow you could help her understand concepts that 3 different teachers couldn't explain. We thought you were just being kind. We didn't realize you were demonstrating a gift. They continued through the albums, pointing out moments I'd forgotten. Times when I'd mediated conflicts between friends by helping each person understand the other's perspective. Projects where I'd found creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Instances where I'd seen potential in people others had written off. The truth is, Dad said, closing the final album, we were scared. Scared that your way of seeing the world was too different, too optimistic, too risky. We wanted to protect you from disappointment by lowering your expectations. But we were wrong, Mom added. Your way of seeing the world, looking for strengths instead of focusing on weaknesses, believing in people's potential instead of accepting their limitations, that's exactly what the world needed. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. We talked about fear and faith, about conventional wisdom and unconventional success, about the difference between protecting someone and limiting them. We talked about how parents' own insecurities can blind them to their children's gifts. Most importantly, we talked about forgiveness. Not because anyone had done anything unforgivable, but because understanding requires letting go of old narratives and embracing new possibilities. There's something we want you to know, Dad said as the afternoon was ending. When Patterson called me Captain's father, I corrected him. I told him I'm not the Captain's father. I'm Marcus Mitchell's dad, and Marcus Mitchell is someone I'm incredibly proud to call my son. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place 3 weeks later, during the Harvard Business School presentation. The auditorium was packed with MBA students, faculty, and business leaders who'd come to hear about the Hartwell transformation. Patterson introduced my father as the keynote speaker, the man who'd revolutionized corporate education by applying principles learned from his educator's son. But when Dad took the stage, he said something that surprised everyone, including me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here under false pretenses. I'm not the innovator in this story. I'm not the visionary who transformed Hartwell Industries. I'm the guy who spent 25 years being too stubborn to listen to his own son. He gestured toward me in the audience. The real captain of this transformation is Marcus Mitchell. Not because he earned advanced degrees or published research or influenced federal policy, though he did all those things, but because he never stopped believing that every person has unique gifts worth discovering and developing. Dad paused, looking directly at me. For 25 years, Marcus tried to teach me that being different isn't the same as being deficient, that struggling with conventional approaches doesn't mean lacking potential. That the very qualities that make someone seem difficult in one context might make them extraordinary in another. The auditorium was completely silent. I spent 2 decades telling my son he'd never amount to anything, but the truth is he was always exactly what the world needed. I just couldn't see it. As applause filled the auditorium, I realized that the phone call at 2:47 a.m. hadn't been about professional recognition or corporate success. It had been about something far more valuable, the moment when the people who matter most finally see you for who you've always been. The word captain wasn't a title I'd earned through achievement. It was recognition that I'd spent my entire life navigating toward a destination others couldn't see, using skills others didn't value, leading others toward possibilities they'd never imagined. And sometimes the most important people you lead toward new understanding are the ones who raised you, loved you, and just needed time to recognize that your differences were actually your gifts. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.